Hi, this is Pastor Tim Delaney coming to you once more as we go through our understanding a little bit of the Bible, doing these little snippets in this way of trying to learn a little bit more. And so far, we've just been kind of getting our way through the first parts of the Bible, in which we've looked at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Today we are looking, if you haven't seen from our little screen part, the book of Numbers. The thing about the book of Numbers is that this takes a little bit of a different approach to things, but yet at the same time it doesn't take away from what we've already been learning and going. Though one of the fascinating things is that as I deep dove a little bit more into the book of Numbers, I found a few little tidbits that were very fascinating that I look forward to sharing with us today as we go about this. But of course, so the first thing that we're going to do is, remember, we're looking at the book of Numbers. See, what's really fascinating that I have found with the book of Numbers is that a couple of things that I found a little bit differently is, just like what we've talked about so far, is our book, is that the authorship for the Numbers still keeps that tie towards Moses. But see, here's one of the most fascinating things I have found about the book of Numbers is that compared to the other books, we actually have this reference in Numbers chapter 33, verse 2, in which I'm going to read to us that real quick, and I'm going to be reading from the NIV, the New International Version, where it says, "At the Lord's command, Moses recorded the stages in their journey." This is their journey by stages. Then, of course, it goes for the next one. Yeah, it pretty much goes all the way up into that current point to where they have been following along of what their journey has been. So we have this whole record that Moses has been commanded to record all that has been going on. So this is one of the very few times that we've actually really seen that Moses is commanded, especially versus compared to the first three. But of course, that is the continues on with the traditional setup, in which, of course, with our scholarly or our more modern viewpoint on this, does not actually discredit this, but actually still holds on to this, especially with the documentary hypothesis. So, of course, it's seen that there are multiple sources that have been consulted in bringing this together, and so we still maintain that with our modernist look. But of course, with that comes our content that actually kind of plays that factor out with all of that, in which because it covers the census of the tribes, rebellion, and the journey of Canaan. I mean, it supposedly brings all that stuff together in that way. And so what we're really seeing with that is that we see a bigger play out in the larger scope of what's going on here. So now, of course, when we look at our next setup, though, and this is what is seen as our genres. Our genres, for the major part, and so looking at Blue Letter Bible, looking at some of our New International, the New Interpreters version, our biblical commentary, and looking at some of our source sets, there is of course the common three, which is the historical, legal, and ritualistic of the genres. And what this all kind of plays into is, of course, what the aspects of this genre is. It gives that structure, it gives themes, it gives a literary style, and of course, as we will look with those, of course, what we see with our structure is that it alternates. One of the big things that we see with this book is that we see a large alternation between a narrative, which of course is one of our big ones that we see with this book, because we are following that one. We go between legal instructions, census. We see a number of times that we find that the census that's going around of the numbers. Numbers plays a big factor, of course, in its namesake of numbers. And then, of course, its literary style, which, of course, this focuses on events and laws. I remember Leviticus focused mostly on the law, mostly focused on the legalistic aspect. This time with Numbers focuses more on central characters, because you're going to see after a while that when we look at our major characters or major figures, I mean, I have 2 slides on this one compared to in the past where we've just had 1. But see, of course, one of the things I also remember, I said that I found some very fascinating things in regards to this. And one of those things is that where I had listed off those 3 primary ones, I found that as I was deep diving, especially we have to remember, since this is Jewish text, our Old Testament is drawn upon the Jewish Tanakh. And of course, as we're looking at the Torah in particular with these first 5 books, um, it's always going to be important to look at Jewish scholarship here. It's going to be very important to look at what the Jewish scholarly set up on this, whether you're looking at the Tanakh itself or its rabbinic commentary work with the Talmud, which I highly recommend as a good source to understand this stuff. But one of the things I found, it was a reference to Rabbi Milgram, and through his work with this is that there is the point out that there is actually up to 14 genres. Rabbi Jacob Milgram, who points out that there are 14 genres that can actually be found within this. And that's everything that we've mentioned before with the narrative, because this follows the narrative history of what's going on with the people. There is poetry in there, so we're seeing some poetry happening. We have prophecy, victory song, we have prayer, blessing, lampoon, and which, of course, I actually had to look that one up. I have not heard that word lampoon in this context, but what we're seeing is that this is similar to like an attack on one's individual, like a verbal, moral, ethical attack on one's person or identity or an individual. And so, of course, I went through and found that. Then, of course, we find diplomatic letter, we find civil law, cultic law, or oracular decision, census list, temple archive, itinerary. So, I mean, this is a massive, big area of what is being covered that Rabbi Milgram suggests and even points out to us with this thing. So it's really important for us to understand that as we look at the genre, because the thing is, in order to understand the context of what's going on, is we need to understand what the literary context is in this, especially as we look at the genre of things. But then, of course, that leads us into what are the major themes that we see playing out in this, like whether it's the themes or the purposes. And so the book of Numbers centers on the theme of Israel's journey from Sinai to Canaan. And so it highlights the tension between God's faithfulness and fulfilling the covenant promises and just the continued rebellion of the people. I mean, they're constantly butting heads with God. And so what the book of Numbers demonstrates to us is that even in light of what the people are doing that's wrong and turning away from God, falling from God, making active choices to rebel against God, that God is always remaining faithful in this setup. Even when it comes to, well, let's just hit that reset button. Or, I mean, when God could use like, okay, I'm just done. That's something we could easily relate to, but yet God, through the book of Numbers, shows us that this is not what's the case. And so what we see that is in these 5 themes I have listed on here. First, covenant fulfillment. It's a book that records the journey of the Exodus generation and their children, showing the gradual fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham regarding the descendants and, of course, that land of milk and honey. And so we're going to see that throughout this book of Numbers. Of course, on the part with rebellion and judgment, we see this huge, this is where we see the bulk of the Israelite people grumbling as they are walking to this way. Because one of the big things that we have to understand is that, remember, they did not just get out of Egypt and then wander around. No, what happened was the people were taken to Canaan. Like Moses took them to that. They looked over and saw these giants, these Philistines, these people that towered and made them scared, and they started doubting and telling God that, God, you don't know what you're talking about. They are seriously arguing and lacking any type of faith to go with God in this. And so now they are sent to wander. And this is where we get that whole 40 years of wandering, because we're looking at that as when the old generation would then no longer be in a new generation. And we'll hear that whole phrase of new generation coming up or a few different times during this time together. So with that in mind, then we see the whole holiness and worship. This is when God provides further instructions for the organization of the camp. We see a little bit more of the whole priestly duties get set up and lined up, and we see an emphasis on, or a further emphasis of how to live out. If you remember from 2 weeks ago, Leviticus laid it all out. Imagine the getting the piece of paper saying this is what you're supposed to do. Numbers then focuses on the actual action of it. And so we see the actual action of them working out and going into this. Then we see our divine grace and guidance. And what this does is that this one shows and focuses, this theme focuses on the fact that despite Israel's failures, God remains faithful. God continues to provide for them, guide them, lead them through as this cloud of fire, which has always been a fascination for me, but leads them to that promised land, that land of milk and honey that we have heard before. And then, of course, that last major theme that focuses on the transition and preparation. This is that book that bridges the gap between receiving the law in Leviticus and entering the promised land, which we see by the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and that leads into the book of Joshua. And so we see this transition, like this is that transition stage. This is that, like, how we get from one point to the other. This is that bridge and that gap, as I say. And so what we end up seeing through all this then is that we find this context and structure of the wilderness. I mean, that's like the biggest way that you could describe the book of Numbers in this. This is the wilderness era. This is the area that covers that whole set. And so if we're going to look at a summary of the whole setup, it's easy enough to put it out like in this, is that the book of Numbers, the fourth book of the Pentateuch, details Israel's 40-year journey from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land, highlighting a pattern of human rebellion met by divine justice and mercy. And so we're seeing this whole system that falls out onto this. We see this entire situation come together where we have this forgiveness that we see that honestly we tend to lack. I mean, I'm going to tie this over into the New Testament for a moment, because it's very easy for us as Christians to try to understand like God's whole promise, God's whole forgiveness, even though we, in light of, mess up so much. And honestly, that's where we see with Numbers. Numbers shows us that as the people are in the heart of the wilderness, the danger, the whole troublesome situations in life, and yet as they bicker, moan, complain, take your choice of words here, that God still remains faithful throughout that entire time together. So now how does that bring us into the different sections? So the Book of Numbers has some fascinating setups here. Ultimately, as I've looked at as I've consulted some of the resources, whether this is the New Interpreter's Bible compared to IVP, which it has a really nice website that allows you to look at these things further in the breakdowns, along with and of course I'm drawing a blank on my other source on this one too. But as you're looking at this, it does this fantastic job of breaking these down to give a little bit of a better idea. And so when we look at the major sections, we have to remember, of course, this is where we're seeing the leaving Mount Sinai. I'm going to sound like a broken record with this. They're leaving Mount Sinai, so we're seeing them camping in the wilderness, moving on their way, going until they get to the Promised Land itself. And that's actually kind of like how we see this broken down, the three sections. The first is that preparation at Mount Sinai, chapters 1 through 10. Where the book opens with a census of the Israelites and specific instructions for arranging the 12 tribes around the tabernacle. This section emphasizes order, purity, and the central presence of God. And so when we look at chapters 1 through 6, that focuses specifically on holiness in the camp. 7 through 10 is where we see the establishment of holy order. So we're seeing a more flushed out understanding of what the role of the Levites are, the line of Aaron. And so we're going to see a little bit more of how that gets flushed out as they leave this. Then of course when we pick up into chapter 11 through 25, we actually see the whole wilderness rebellion of things. This is where the narrative transitions to the journey marked by crisis, complaints, and rebellions against Moses and God. I mean, this is one of my favorite sections where all of a sudden I imagine Moses just like doing this, and then turning to God, help me out here. Come here, God. What am I supposed to do? I can't handle this. This is just too much. But I mean, once again, as we've looked at with previous books of this, especially Exodus, sorry for any of those who are fans of Moses, but he's a complainer. He kind of looks at the dimmer side of things. Though that does kind of match against my own optimistic point of view of things, but that's just who we have as we see this. And so this, of course, comes out into consequences of things. 11 through 19, chapters 11 through 19 of this section focuses on complaints and conflict in the wilderness, where we're seeing this real like big headbutt of things. 20 and through 21 shows them leaving the wilderness when they're coming up to the mountain that will take them into the next promised land of things. And then, of course, when we get to chapter 22 through 25, we see the rising threats to Israel on the plains of Moab. This is one of the big situations that we see with Moab. And, of course, the Moabites, who we've seen this, have a very fascinating history through the line of Lot. And Lot, of course, remember, Lot had relations with one of his daughters. That brought about the Moabs, which then, of course, has contention that we'll see throughout the Old Testament with the Israelite people. So this is not the first and last time we hear about the Moabites, but this is where we're going to really see this first major conflict. And, of course, that's where we have our third section, which is 26 through 23, which I've labeled the Plains of Moab. This is the final section, focusing on the new generation, featuring a second census, the transition of leadership to Joshua, and laws for inheriting the promised land. And so we see this whole instruction setup of everything that plays out into this. So, of course, as we look at not just the sections itself, but remember, we always look at what the narrative flow, because as much as the Bible plays a major factor into as a wonderful tool for our faith, it's still a very fascinating story, because remember, the early steps were oral traditions. So that means they were told in stories, which is our narrative stuff. Unless you're Ken from 30 Rock, who said his favorite history book is the Old Testament, I mean, we're looking at something different here. But of course, as we're looking at this overall narrative, we have this whole moving from orderly, hopeful preparation to a chaotic failure to a disciplined anticipation of the future. And so, of course, this break, if we look at it from a narrative flow versus sectional setup like we did before, we see a slight change in the scriptural breakdown. Like as I said, I'm going to back up from this one. We had it in 3, which you can see in this one. If we look at the narrative, it adds in that 4th one there, and so we're looking at different ones. So, of course, 1 through 4 focuses on the camp, establishing the structure and holiness of the community. Chapter 5 through 10. So, really, in all reality, it just kind of broke down that very first one, which then focuses on the ritual laws, purity and blessing. So this one, we're looking at the whole ritual laws, like what is expected of them in the ritual aspect of faith. And then, of course, complaining and judgment, which is similar to what we saw with 11 through 25 with our wilderness rebellion. And then we have 26 through 36 with the plains of Moab. But if we're looking at it from a narrative flow of things, we're looking at the whole setup with transition and inheritance, which of course is that transition with the new generation of things. So then we look at next is, of course, we look at the themes that we go. So the thematic or the theme progress of what is going on to this, because I, of course, have been offering us 3 different approaches to this. Whether we look at this sectionally, narratively, and now we look at the thematic aspect of things. And what's more, we even make this even bigger and broader of things. So of course, what we're seeing here as we look at the theme of things is that we're going to see a stark contrast between God's faithfulness to his covenant and the chronic disobedience of the Israelite people. We're going to see this highlight of divine judgment, necessity of faith, this obedience to holiness, and transition from old to new. And you heard a few of those in here as we look at the first one of divine faithfulness versus human rebellion. I mean, at the very core of what this entire book falls upon God versus the people. We see this divineness versus humanity. We see faithfulness versus rebellion. And so this becomes the stark contrast of what the whole book itself is about, is seeing that difference between God and humanity, which then falls upon the fact that why the people are then to wander for 40 years, the transition from one generation to the other, which we see with our second theme. The book is structured around 2 distinct generations. The first generation that is wandering in the wilderness and dies And that covers from our Numbers 1 through 25 to the newer, younger generation that is promised and prepared to enter the promised land from 26 through 36. Our major theme, and this has sound redundant compared to the first point, the holiness of God, which is a major theme that in light of, or in spite of what the people have been doing, God still remains faithful to them. I mean, God could have just easily wiped them out. God could have just said, "I'm done." God could have just said, we're going to go in a different direction on this one. It's not you, it's me. Well, really, I mean, it is you, but hey, we're going to go a different direction with things. But yet, God always remains faithful among the people. And then, of course, the major theme is, remember, that return back to Canaan, the promised land, that place that God had promised Abraham when he was wandering around. And so that whole return to the promised land is that fulfillment of God's promise. Then we look at, of course, the major theme of the leadership and organization. I mean, our major leader is Moses, which we're going to see in a little bit, did not fit so well for other people. In fact, it led to some very disgruntled siblings, some very disgruntled other leaders who thought that they could do this better, that Moses being the solo leader was not a good idea, but it should be a particular group of people should actually be the real leaders, because that their whole culture is based around their religion. So that might give you an idea of who they thought who that group might be. But yet, what we see is that this is to maintain a sense of faithfulness in everything there is. Then, of course, that final one is judgment and mercy. And what we're seeing is that God's response to the rebellion is both severe and short term, as we see with the judgment. Because remember, the old generation would not be allowed to see would not be able to enter the promised land, which unfortunately also included Moses, even though he was the whole designated leader by God in all of this. To the merciful ultimate that the Hebrew people would return to their homeland. It just would not be the same as it once was then. So, now we look at our major characters. So remember, as I said before, this is going to be a long list. There's a lot of people that go on here. And it's everything from the people of Israel to Moses to the Moabites to what those younger group and people would look like and entail with things. And so what we see with our primary leaders and figures here is, of course, Moses. And Moses, of course, has this whole our central figure. He's credited as the author of the book. He's the main leader. He's the one that brought them out of Exodus. He's been kind of going from the big step. Then we see Aaron, Moses' brother. That's not a new name. We've seen him before. He is the first high priest of Israel. He's like the big honcho of their worship. He plays that major role in priestly duties along with Miriam. But like I said before, they don't have that personal interaction with God, so they get jealous. They think that, well, they're Moses' siblings. They're older than him. That they should also have that position and be able to talk with God. Doesn't go so well for them. Next name on here is Joshua, in which who we see with Joshua, he's like the second in command. He is one of the two faithful spies who believed God would give them the land. He's chosen as the successor. He would actually be the leader that brings the new generation into the promised land. It would, like I said, it would not be Moses. Then we have Caleb, son of Jephunneh, one of the 12 spies who, along with Joshua, brought a positive report of the land and trusting God. He was one of the two, as I said before, along with Joshua, that remained faithful, that saw those giants, the Philistines, these massive, scary people, and said that we can do this. But the others weren't there. There's Eleazar, the son of Aaron, who takes up the role of high priest after his father's death, in which, interestingly enough, he plays a much better figure and role into this. Then, of course, there's Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, who actually, along with Aaron, rebels against Moses because, remember, of that jealousy. In fact, ironically, between the two of them, she's the one, having been more vocal about, who is struck with leprosy, but then is cured of it. But yet, without in any good narrative and any good story, you have to have some type of villain. Whether this was the people's own hubris in Genesis, to Pharaoh in Exodus, to what we saw in Leviticus among the people themselves and their own hubris once again. We actually have people on here. And like I said before, there was a group of people, the Levites, especially a core group of them led by Korah, who led a major rebellion against Moses and Aaron, challenging their authority, who felt that he himself particularly, he kind of hid it behind as the Levites, that if they are going to be the spiritual leaders of the people, then they should be the one in charge. Not Moses, who isn't even a Levite, who isn't even part of the priestly order of things. Korah was quickly supported by Dathan and Abiram, who were Reubenites, who joined Korah in the rebellion. And when I say Reubenites, they came from the tribe of Reuben. The thing about the 12 tribes is that these are the 12 tribes of Isaac, the 12 sons. Reuben having been the one that was seen as one of the leaders of the brothers themselves at the time of Joseph. Not Joshua, Joseph. Then, of course, we have the spies. These are, remember, so one of the things that I didn't highlight very much is that when Moses led the people to the promised land, he sent 12 tribes. This was, of course, to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. They went out and they scouted the land. 2 of them, which of course was Caleb and Joshua, came back with positive reports saying, we got this. God's going to get us through this. But then you have the 10 leaders who brought a bad report of Canaan, and that caused the Israelites to doubt and rebel, which then, of course, that led into them being cast out into having to wander for 40 years. But some of our other figures that we see in here, too, is Balaam, who was a non-Israelite prophet and diviner hired by Balak to curse Israel, but who is compelled by God to bless them instead. So, I mean, this was someone who worked for the king of Moab. This was a Moabite. So someone who was not happy with the Israelite people, but was compelled to actually do the right thing, which this shows us very much that God can and will work through anyone and everyone, even those who don't believe in the same way as us, or in this case, as the Israelite people itself. We'll see something similar to this when we get to King Saul in in one of our later steps, who consults a non-Israelite for help. Then we have Balak, the king of Moab, who fears the Israelites and hires Balaam to curse them. We have Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, who is noted for his zeal for God, stopping a plague by killing an Israelite man and a Midianite woman. Part of their purity culture, I'm going to use it in that context, no, part of their cleanliness, I should say, is that the people were instructed not to cohabitate, not to intermingle with other groups, because there was a fear of that distilling the Hebrew faith. Not the whole, it's not a racism thing in this case, but in this case with this, it had more to do with a firm belief in things. That there was a belief that if they intermingled with the other people, that they would then lose sight of the relationship with God. So we see this whole situation really, and unfortunately that feeds and stems a lot of our hate groups that we see today, whether it's in xenophobia, but it can also be looked towards sexism, racism. So I mean, we see a lot of this, especially in these cases, get used to help support hate in this situation, which is not something that that we are called to do or to be like when it comes to following in Jesus. Then, of course, another key figure is that new generation. This is the younger generation of Israelites born in the wilderness. And this is the children, the grandchildren of those of the older generation who are born, who, unlike their parents, were prepared and taught and to lead into the promised land. Then, of course, that last one should be very familiar, as I talked about Yahweh before, but the name of God, in which, as Christians, we're more comfortable saying that because it plays, names for us plays in a very different context and different way of doing things than it does for the Jewish people. So where we would, I mean, rightly so, if we were to follow in their tradition, we would not refer to God in that way, which probably from this day forward, I'm going to probably refrain from doing it and maintain with the whole list of other names that we have in reference to God. This way, I'm doing this in honor and reverence with even those who agree with the Jewish people and not using the name in that case then. So what does that mean for our key themes? So our key themes and teachings. So we talked about a thematic approach earlier, which this for the most part is very similar to. Slightly different in the case that we have 6 in here where there's the emphasis on God's guidance. So what does God's guidance look through these themes? Fulfillment of divine promises. So it's not just in God fulfilling the promise to the people, but also the fulfillment of promises on our behalf with God. Rebellion and divine justice, which marks the that there will be times that the people will butt heads with God. It's the same way we are today. Even the most devout Christians will sometimes bump heads with God because we don't seem to understand what's going on, and that's because God is on a whole different level than us, but yet God wants to walk beside us. God's faithfulness and mercy, so we see this we have this constant ability to break our promises. Jesus put it as simply as love God, love neighbor. We don't always follow that very well, but yet God always remains faithful. The wilderness training and testing, we see this wilderness is portrayed as a place of testing, refinement, and learning to depend on God. That's a major factor of what this wilderness was about, was to teach the people that as scary as those people might be, you're going to go through all of this and know that God is with you in this. We see law and order, which we see the outlines of regulation of how things are supposed to be done. And then, of course, leadership challenges, in which the text highlights the importance of and challenges faced by godly leadership, including the meditation of Moses and his eventual successor of Joshua. So some of our key teachings in here is the consequences of unbelief, in which this shows us that the people who left Egypt still struggled in their lack of faith. Power of obedience, following God's commands beyond or brings blessing and progress, while turning from God leads to failure. God's presence, this is of course the whole set that through the camps, the way the camp was structured, it was set up with God's holy tent, which would one day be the temple that we see with Jerusalem, but it would be this teaching that God is at the center of his people's life, requiring a just way of living. And then of course we see that generational transition, in which we see the book emphasizes the preparing, especially 26 through 36, from going from old into new. So what we see for our conclusion for all of this is that the book of Numbers determines or demonstrates God's unwavering faithfulness to the promises made. Sin has consequences, but God remains faithful, present, and merciful. I mean, that's the ultimate message that we see when it comes to God out of the book of Numbers. No matter how badly we screw up, God's always going to be there. When we stumble, God picks us up. When it becomes too much for us to hold, God bears us on God's shoulders. Think of the footsteps in the stands, which of course would have probably been a better one. Nothing against Mike Slaughter on this one, but footsteps in the sand probably would have been a really good application for today. But yet what I chose with Mike Slaughter here is that faith doesn't precede the journey, it grows out of the journey. The people had their faith there, but they struggled, they lost it, they lost hope, and so faith was regrown, it grew, it became more. And so that's what it means for us today. Trust in God's faithfulness. We're always going to struggle through the wilderness. It's just the wilderness today doesn't mean going through deserts or through rough terrain. Sometimes it means making tough, hard choices, whether that is choosing to do the right thing. When you see someone being beaten down, someone who is struggling, someone who's going through a hardship, that we step up and be there with them. We meet them where they are. Obedience over rebellion. And what this means is not obedience to human laws in this case, but in godly stuff where Jesus says, love your neighbor. So does that mean that when you see someone being treated poorly, you just step back and say, well, that's on them? No, you step up with them, knowing that God's presence is always there with us, It means commitment to God and working with God. I mean, the people could not eat. I mean, people were given 10 commandments, and they couldn't even uphold it. Jesus comes, puts it into 2 simple laws for us. And it's the whole love your name, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. But I'm going to make it even easier. I mean, Jesus pretty much said this: love God, love neighbor. That's what it is. Well, unfortunately, we still kind of screw that up. So Peter and Paul, in their letters later, before the book of Revelation, in their letters, they pretty much are focused on this thing: just love. That's what it comes down to. We are just to love. And that's the main thing that we can take from the book of Numbers here, is that when it's too much for us, it's not too much for God. So we can turn to God and we see God through ourselves, through one another. So I hope you've enjoyed this setup here. Numbers had a lot going on to it, and honestly, I would love to have been able to go a little bit further into this stuff, but I'm trying to keep these within a certain time frame of things. So I challenge you to go ahead and take a moment and read through the book of Numbers. Consult commentaries. There are a lot of good resources out there to be able to look into this and to read more on it. I strongly encourage you to do that. And so, because next week what we're going to do is we're going to wrap up these books of the Bible, these first 5 books of the Bible, the Mosaic Laws, the Pentateuch, with Deuteronomy. And Deuteronomy is going to have a lot for us to tackle with. I knew from the beginning of these first 5 books of the Bible were going to be a little bit more difficult than the others. From here forward, some of the books we're going to be combining together, like Chronicles and Kings. We'll look at a few of the other ones, especially when we get to the minor prophets. We'll probably do more than one per session because they're much shorter. But depending on what their lengths are and how we're looking at, we're going to be going about that. So I hope you enjoyed this time together as we look to the book of Numbers. And so in 2 weeks, we'll then pick up again, and we will look at the book of Deuteronomy, and we'll wrap up that little step. So I hope you've had a good time during this session. If you have any questions, feel free to comment in the comments below. If you're watching on Facebook, or if you're watching on our church's YouTube, you're more than welcome to leave a comment on there too. Questions. I encourage people to question their faith, because one of the things that I was always taught growing up is that the only way to properly learn is to ask questions. My social studies teacher, Mr. Norm Lehman, in middle school, would often say, "Are you really learning if you're not asking questions?" So I know there's a shout out to him on that one. He was a really good role model for me. But so I encourage you to question and to grow. So with that all in mind, I hope you have yourself a good day, have a good rest of the week, and that you are able to see the good that comes through you, with you, and of you. So let this be with you as we are now, and I hope you have a good one. See you later.